Hello, everyone. These are the Mint Budget Conversations. And in this session, we're going to be taking a look at bilateral trade and bridging the gaps. Trade, investment, how does India engage with the external world as it builds towards that $5 trillion economy? There's been a lot of debate and discussion about FTAs and what should happen, and should India join FTAs or should they not? We've heard the Commerce Minister and others saying India doesn't want to join these just to become part of a club, but to actually have benefits. How do we drive exports? How do we position India in the new global supply chains? Is there an opportunity that is being thrown up by what's happening on the China front? What can happen to attract foreign investments into India? These are just some of the themes that we are going to be discussing over the next 45 minutes or an hour. And let me welcome our guests. It's a pleasure and a privilege to have with us Paul Jenson, who's the Managing Director at the European Business and Technology Center. He's here in Delhi with us right now. Davinder Sandhu is the chairman and of Primus Partners, being one of the knowledge partners for this entire series, will be helping shed light on what is happening. Smita Purushottam is former ambassador to Switzerland and is the founder of SITARA, which is doing some sterling work in the field right now. And Dr. Biswajit Dhar is a professor at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at the School of Social Sciences at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, a center. I have to say, Dr. Dhar, great talking to you. It's a center that I once studied in briefly many years ago. So it's a pleasure talking to you. Thank you all so much for being with us. I just wanted to kick off first. We'll leave this fairly free-flowing to get everyone's views on what should happen and what should not happen. Perhaps arrive at some policy recommendations for the government, both for what the finance minister can say on the budget, although I suspect she's drafted a lot of her speech already, and what the government should be doing in general. The external sector, Mr. Jenson, why don't I start with you? When you look at the entire concept of driving trade with India, driving investments into India, building partnerships between India and other countries in the world, what are the major thoughts that come to you? What are the positives of the way things are going right now? What are the possible negatives? Mr. Jenson, could you hear me?
Sorry, I didn't hear that you posed a question to myself. Sorry, yes, Vikram. Thank you very much. Yeah. And also thank you for having me here. I think my claim to this panel is probably due to the fact that I've spent 17 years in India. I came with a German company to set up business for them here, and since 2010 I've been with the European Business and Technology Center. And the space we operate in, Vikram, is exactly all about making collaborations happen across the border between Europe and Indian businesses and Europe and Indian technologies. And you mentioned the FTA. Obviously, there's a free trade agreement negotiation that's been going on for the longest of time between Europe and between the EU and India. And that has just been revived recently, following also a set of high-level strategic meetings that have happened between the EU and India, to the greatest extent focusing on sustainability, on security, and the latest one where there was a deal on a connectivity partnership really emphasized a much deeper strategic relationship between Europe and India in the whole corridor that also reaches into the Pacific. So a lot of that is based on collaboration. I think both parties are looking at getting away from dependencies but creating linkages. Yeah, and I think that is also the benefit for India to work with someone closely like the European Union to sort of have a geopolitical balance. We know how things are developing in other parts of the world, and that would be a good access, a good corridor to strengthen. And that strengthening will only happen if we also, apart from politicians, also get businesses on board. So then that has to be a lot of focus on increasing the ability, conduciveness, the environment for businesses to actually collaborate, for business to invest. So for European business to invest in India, for Indian business to invest in Europe, and do that together. And in fact, there's also a lot of focus in that partnership on development funds, on green financing. So for instance, the European Investment Bank, which touts itself as the world's climate bank, also has a very, very large focus on India, wants to pump in money into infrastructure in India, but not only in India, but together with India in the whole corridor. And I think that's a tantalizing opportunity. But as we said, we have to look at what makes everything conducive to make businesses also get involved in this in a big way and actually be interested in investing and interested in collaborating.
All right. How do you get businesses interested in collaborating? How do you get them interested in investing? We heard what the Prime Minister said at Davos just a couple of days also back, making that direct appeal to businesses and to other countries, saying you should come to India. I would like in the course of the next 20-25 minutes understand that message and see what some of the inducements are that could be given to drive that process forward, and what some of the potential barriers could be. But Smita, why don't I turn to you next? If you look at the overall landscape right now, how would you assess it? What's working well, what's not working well?
Thank you very much. I'll just very quickly tackle the issue of trade and investment, and then come to the experience I had in Switzerland on these issues. Some very practical, on the ground kind of feedback that I would like to share. So very, very quickly, the free trade agreements that India has signed so far, the ITA 1, the comprehensive agreements with Japan, ASEAN, and South Korea, led to a crash in India's electronics manufacturing sector, and a huge decline, a huge increase in import intensity. And a lot of people, including Professor Biswajit Dhar, with whom I've been in very active contact, have attributed it to a lack of an industrial policy. And there I would just like to request the government that an industrial policy should not be just about schemes which are agnostic, applicable to all. It should have firm commitments on domestic procurement, because we just saw Tata's, sell off their data centers. And so the semiconductor scheme may go the same way, in the sense that if we don't have firm commitments for domestic procurement, who's going to invest? We need a market. And of course, a very heavy emphasis on R&D. That does not mean we should close ourselves off to any free trade agreement, because it is, as Mr. Jenson said, it's good to have a balance, a geopolitical balance in our engagement. And Europe and the US could be good partners, but we have to be cautious and see that our own industries are strong enough to withstand the competition. And I feel we're not doing enough. For example, Cisco has said in a letter to the government in which it wants to become a domestic company, it says it wants to be classified as a domestic company, that it's of manufacturing, high-tech manufacturing in India suffers an 8% disadvantage. And I was just looking at the figures from Switzerland. FDI figures have really declined massively from Switzerland. And FDI from Switzerland was in the good high-tech manufacturing sectors. Now, if we need to attract that kind of investment, which creates, multiple ancillary opportunities also, and of course brings very good R&D and high technology to India. So we need to tackle that particular issue, that is ease of living in India, ease of investment in the brick and mortar space. If we can tackle these issues, I'm sure we can lead to a huge rejuvenation in good FDI. And I mean by that high-tech manufacturing FDI. Thank you.
Davinder, Sandhu, some people have interpreted Atmanirbhar Bharat as a return to autarkic policies, a return to, India wants to look inwards, India wants to protect its own industries, India doesn't want to be open. Now, the government's been at pains to say that's not what the intention of Atmanirbhar Bharat is. What is your assessment? Because some of the autarkic policies were followed earlier in the 50s and 60s and 70s, didn't work very well. Post-liberalization, obviously, the Indian economy has done much better. What is your own assessment of India's attitude in general to the external world and to bilateral trade in particular?
Thanks, Vikram. I think that's a very relevant and deeper question at many levels. So let me just make three broad points. First point, all about FTAs, it has an economic basis. The government is only an honest referee. Finally, it's the consumers and producers in two geographies who are brought together. So that's the first fundamental. It has to be led by economics. It cannot be led by purely political considerations or pure relationships between government heads. It has to be backed by strong business case, economic sense for the producers and consumers of the two respective geographies that are under consideration. The second point is, in a connected world, what matters is value chains. What we have been looking at is regions and say, let me have an FTA with A, B, and C. Now, that can be the end result, but that cannot be the starting process. The starting point has to be which are those products where we have got a cost advantage, a competition advantage, a quality advantage, an IP advantage, and how can we leverage that to create competitive advantage?
I think we just lost Mr. Sandhu. There. Sorry, you're back.
Yeah, we just lost for a second. Free
Yeah.
trade could also say that I am capturing a part of the value chain. There is a raw material that's originating from somewhere else, which I get to India. I add value, and maybe I add part value. Maybe I pass it to another FTA, and then the final consumer is in a third FTA. I mean, look at the example of India today is the largest exporter of oil and gas pipes. The specialty steels are imported by India. There is base work which is done by India within the Indian territory, and around 70% of the value is added. Those oil and gas pipelines are materializing on the US shores where the final value addition is being done. So here is a value chain that we have captured, and we've got inherent advantages in that. So that's my second point. Look at products, look at where we have the comparative advantage, where it is a win-win for everybody. It's not just a political negotiation of who can bring the best out of their pocket on the negotiation table that day. That's the second point. The third point about autarkic policies, Vikram, you're right. I think we are a large domestic market, and we are very proud of that, and the whole world eyes us. But at the end of the day, I think global experience tells us that even large domestic economies like China, which is a larger one than ours, really needed the trade and foreign trade and bilateral trade and free trade areas to grow. That's not a lesson that should be lost in anybody for various reasons. So I think these are the three important parts that I see are very critical to our FTA kind of policy paradigm. I'm very enthused by the minister I was reading yesterday saying that this process has to be industry-led. It cannot be led by the government in that sense. And finally, it's going to make economic sense. You got economic partners coming together on both ends into joint ventures, buying things off each other and selling each other's products in each other's geography. So it has to be led by economics, and it has to be led by industry and by producer and consumer organizations. And in that sense, I think India's Make in India program has gone a fundamental change. The Prime Minister himself has now been saying, make in India, but make for the world. And I think that's a very welcome change, because that means that we are not just looking inward and saying, okay, make here, but we are looking at the rest of the world. We are saying how we can network, how we can have win-win agreements with everybody, and see which part of the value chain we can have in our own geography to our advantage, and then do the rest of our partners' advantages too. So I think It's not purely autarkic in that sense, and I think I see a lot of sort of silver lining on the conversation today.
All right, I'm going to be asking everyone about the FTAs and free trade agreements and what is the correct way to structure them. But before I do that, Professor Dhar, if I could just get your sort of opening comments, and specifically around the conceptual structure that you think India should be following in its dealings with the world. So Mr. Sandhu is saying that Atmanirbhar Bharat does not mean, certainly should not mean autarkic policies, because those didn't work very well in the past. But you should try and leverage the strengths of Indian industry as part of that entire process. How would you see the overall framework?
Yeah, thank you, Vikram, and thank you for having me in this conversation. And it's an extremely important conversation that we must have. I think we must have this conversation more often, and something that is not happening. Let me put my point of view here, because you just mentioned, and Mr. Sandhu also mentioned about the flip side of being inward looking. Now, what happened in India was that after the economic reforms, we went from one extreme to the other. The sense that we had this whole very inward looking an attitude to produce everything here, and from there we flipped on the other side, and then the attitude was that you're going to be importing everything. Now, if you look at all the successful countries, who have actually been very successful in leveraging this whole process of economic engagement with the rest of the world and part of globalization, you'll find that they have been very strategic in their moves in the sense that they have promoted their industries very strategically. Now, Mr. Sandhu use this term comparative advantage. I'm not a very great fan of that because, as someone who teaches trade, it's not neither here nor there. But the point is that I agree with him that the industry should be really in the set is the center.
Professor Dhar, I think we've lost Professor Dhar just for a moment or so. So, Mr. Jenson, while we get Professor Dhar back, let me just throw that. I think we're still trying to understand conceptually the way bilateral trade and all should be approached, because that's going to influence the government's thinking to some extent. So, a couple of aspects around that. Obviously, we are far away from some of the beliefs. Professor Dhar, I think you're back. So let me just try and hear you.
This is one big problem, the connectivity issue here. No, so what I was mentioning is that having spent a whole lot of years with the policy making with the government, I haven't seen an effective engagement with the industry. In the formulation of policies. Again, we have all our partners, the FTA partners in the Southeast East Asian region, many of them, of course. One lesson that we do not, or we haven't actually taken from those countries is that there always been a very strong industry-government partnership. Industry has been telling the government what to do and how to move. Now, it cannot be a top-down. So in that sense, the mindset hasn't changed, I would say. We have just opened up our economies, but in the sense that the government, the government control over the economy and the government's control over what the country should be doing or the industry should be doing remains quite the same. So I think in terms of the mindset, and this is something that, again, with Smita also we have been talking about, is that unless the government puts his ears on the ground and listens to what the industry wants, you just can't, be providing the right kind of inputs to the industry. So the big change that must take place is that the government should do a lot of hand-holding to the industry. Should understand what the requirements of the industry are and then respond. You can't just, you can't have a supply side kind of a situation yet. You just keep on putting things on the ground. And these are the things that the industry doesn't need. And the industry actually, at the end of the day, suffers. So those are my initial points that I wanted to make. Thank you very much.
All right, Smita, just before I come to the others, your reaction to what Professor Dhar said. Listen to industry is one of the important things. And what's actually bothering industry may be somewhat different to what is sometimes felt, especially when it comes to engagement with the rest of the world. So what, to your mind, are the things that, when it comes to engagement with the rest of the world, what are the sort of issues that you think industry would be concerned about? Some of the policies do come, and Atmanirbhar Bharat also comes from, we don't want to be swamped by China. And now we don't necessarily want to be swamped by some of the big tech giants, which are very dominant around the world. So those are the sort of fears that can India and Indian industry compete effectively with them. But what to your mind does Indian industry itself feel about these subjects?
Thank you so much. So, industrial policy has become a dirty word because of the way it was implemented post-independence. And as somebody said, we've thrown out the baby with the bathwater. But look at America, look at China, South Korea, Japan, even Europe. Industrial policy is extremely popular. Every day in the US, a new industrial policy regulation is issued, whether it's for promotion of the chips industry, the CHIPS Act, and so on. So it isn't, as long as you leave it to market forces and not rely just on the public sector to implement, which creates corruption, shortages, etc., which happened pre-reforms, there can be a market-led industrial policy, as Professor Dhar said, with industry and government interacting to come up with a good package, in which I've already emphasized domestic procurement and R&D investment is the key. And I also was posted in China for 3 years. I did a lot of studies on China, and China had a very closed economy. It had very low tariffs for raw materials, and it encouraged the processing trade. It also joined the Information Technology Agreement several years after India did, and India liberalized to 0% duty years before China did. and also opened up to the other economies. So China grew in fact, we've just done a study on the telecom sectors of both countries. China grew its ICT and telecom sector to a huge extent. And when it was strong, then it joined ITA 1, then it joined the WTO, got all the advantages of access to the Indian market, for example, and then ITA 1, after its industry was on solid grounds, by which time we had destroyed ours. So that's why I'm a little afraid, and I urge caution in opening up. And at the same time, I'm not against it. I think we must become competitive. We must have the right pricing in our economy. We need to have a very strong market-oriented industrial policy, which emphasizes R&D and also domestic procurement. Thank you.
Right. Mr. Jenson, I think aspects of this debate have been raging for like decades. I seem to remember having many of these same arguments discussed when I was studying trade at Dr. Dhar's department, in a sense, many decades ago. What is the way these issues are really being seen now in countries like Europe? Because it's at the crux of the debates and discussions we have, even around for FTAs or tariffs or non-tariff barriers, or are you being protectionist, or are you just doing justifiable protection of your own economy? These issues are at the core of it. What is the correct way for a country to approach it? Are you correct in saying I need to protect my own industry and my own companies and give them a leg up, not just throw them open to full competition? Or are you not? What's the way Europe and others are seeing this now?
So I would look at this a bit different, Vikram. If I was the Indian government and I would want to attract investment, I would like to enhance trade. I would like to become more resilient. I would look at what is it that investors want? What is it that other economic operators? What is it that foreign companies would want? Yeah. So if I am in Europe and I'm an SME or even a large company, the numbers say that to the greatest extent, outward FDI from Europe to emerging markets goes to China, and then a bit dribbles into India, a bit dribbles into South America, and a few other places. But why is it not coming in big numbers to India? And I don't know. I've obviously had a lot of discussions with European companies who have invested already 10, 15, maybe even 20 years ago in China. But what they say unilaterally is that there has just been clarity. It was very clear what was the framework, what were the rules, what could be done and what could not be done. And the jury is out whether it was the right way to go and right way to invest for European companies today. I think there's a lot of challenges, even looking back today. But so one thing is the clarity in India. If I invest in India, will I be able to earn returns? So there's a big market. There's no doubt about that. But there are a lot of things. There's a lot of regulations. There's a lot of policy. There's a lot of a few case studies that show that even retrospective regulations are put in place that hamper any profitable investment in India. But there are a lot of other things. So why am I, as a large company, not to a great extent putting India as part of my value chain? Yeah, I'm seeing India as a market. So if I go and invest in India, I want the market to be in India. But now with the pandemic, a lot of eyes have been opened. So maybe we shouldn't put all eggs in one basket. Maybe we should look at different value chains, diversifying value chains to make them more resilient. And then India, I think this is a huge opportunity for the government to put structures, to put frameworks in place to attract that investment. But there are fundamental things that need to be put in place as well. So I think some of the earlier sessions that you've had here have also highlighted infrastructure. I'd also like to highlight logistics. Logistics is a huge enabler of economic activity. So investment will flow. One big impediment for investment to India, for manufacturing investment towards India, is because we're unsure of how efficient is the logistics sector. Will goods move on time? So I mean, there's a lot of things that need to be taken into account, and that's what I'm trying to say, that the government should think about what would a foreign actor, economic actor, highlight, what's important there before I put my money towards India.
I think what you just said, Mr. Jenson, is at the crux of a lot of the debates. I'm just going to spend some time discussing what you have said in some detail. Mr. Sandhu, let me start with you on that point, because yes, you've had the Prime Minister, for example, talking at Davos right now, saying, come and invest in India. And yes, this is the perfect opportunity. People are wanting to diversify away from China, so you want to look at India. Now, it's not entirely, as Mr. Jenson just put it very eloquently, it's not just about, yes, of course, there's a market in India. Yes, of course, there's great potential out here. But sometimes what bothers foreign investors is actually something which is surprisingly easy for the government to fix. It's not about giving incentives and giving them billions of dollars in incentives alone, although that's helpful. It's just about giving them assured policies. It's about not having retrospective tax, which Mr. Jenson referred about. It's about having consistency of policy. It's about telling them you will not be harassed. You will not face red tape. You will not have Inspector Raj. You will not be locked up in court cases for decades. You won't be suddenly hauled up for something you may have done 10 years ago. Those are the sort of things which, and every conversation you have with foreign investors, they echo almost exactly what Mr. Jenson said. That's what they worry about in India more than anything else. Mr. Sandhu?
Yes, I think these are the learnings that India is now taking away, because clearly, gone are the days when, a chief minister could have a photo op with a large investor, promise them some land, promise them some GST subvention, etc., etc. No, investors are not wanting that. In a series of conversations with some of the states out of the US, in a conversation facilitated by the USTR, and last week we were speaking to the Taiwanese Confederation of Industry. The point they're making is these are hygiene issues. You cannot attract us on these bases. If you say that there is land and my red tape will not bother you, this is hygiene. This is not even part of the conversation anymore. And you may be Maharashtra and you may think you are great and you are competing with Gujarat or Punjab or Haryana. But finally, for me, you are competing with Vietnam and Thailand and everything else. So it's a global world in terms of getting everybody in. The whole excitement, Vikram, around the budget itself is a big disabler. Why should we wait every year to understand what policy changes are going to come? I will not come and investment in a 30-year asset or a 20-year asset cycle for my plant or my products if I am not sure that the life of the policy is not beyond 364 days. And on 1st February, the government can stand up and change that policy. We need to have, policy regarding trade and investment, not as some kind of a destination. It cannot be reached. It's a continuous journey. And if there are changes to the milestones that come on the journey, that has to be with complete, participation, and complete understanding of industry and the consumer and the producer. It cannot come as a government-aided or a government-mandated process. So the whole point about what the eminent colleagues on the panel are absolutely right in saying this, that there has to be a point of view where the government is seen purely as a facilitator and an enabler, not as even, some heavy-handed regulator. It's for the industry and the consumers and the producers to go forward. And I think there's a very important point that Smita just made, and that was about R&D. All countries who benefited from trade have finally had their R&D and IPs. You cannot be a screwdriver nation and then participate in the value chain. Take the example of the iPhone. 10 years ago, China got only 7% of the revenue out of the iPhone that you purchased. No longer. Today, they hold IPs and R&D. And therefore, they're in the 20s now out of the value chain process. That's a very important part. I think those enablers are where the government needs to work and not come in with a heavy hand. Make sure there is policy consistency. Make sure that there is a regime that or a technology regime that allows an R&D and those IPs to develop. And the other point is about FTAs. Let's not look for big announcements that heads of governments can have a photo op and shake hands and say, oh, we did this, we did that. Let industry collaborate, be on the sidelines, and take those small wins. As I said, it's a journey. There are milestones along the way, and it's a continuous improvement. I think this is the kind of sort of framework that we would request the government to consider in a long-term, view of trade and investment.
Right. Smitaji, you were ambassador to Switzerland. It's went to Davos almost 15 years. And I think consistently what we kept hearing from virtually every major company were themes around this line. To some extent, it's good news that it's easier to fix things like we are not going to have policy flip-flops and we will not harass you, or we will have ease of doing business. Those are easier things to fix than infrastructure. Now, infrastructure, power has gone up, telecom is there, digital infrastructure is there. So we are starting to get their roads are being built. This is something which can be fixed. I remember, ma'am, when I went to Davos just after retrospective tax had been announced, virtually everybody I met said, you've just set the India story back by a decade, because the fact that you can have a policy flip-flop like this means that we are uncertain. That, unfortunately, was probably true. It did set the India story back by about a decade. Now, that's being repealed. Is this the area that if you were advising the government, you would tell them, send out the message in clear terms, there will be no harassment, there will be policy, consistency of policy, there will not be overbearing regulation, as Mr. Sandhu was saying. We will give you a benign, low-touch atmosphere, and we will ensure that government and government agencies, anybody else, is not going to bother you too much. Would that be the one single message you would ask the finance minister to put out to everyone, starting with the budget?
Absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt about it. There's a consensus on this issue from all quarters, and including my interactions with the top CEOs in Switzerland, Steiner, Schindler, ABB. They all emphasize these issues. And if I may just refer to what Sri Sandhu said, China has had a very good policy of these special economic zones where a lot of foreign investors located their investments. And I visited one of them in Zhuhai. It had just been set up, and it was just so incredible, the infrastructure in the 90s. And also at the same time, the issue of ease of living, everything had been taken care of, including tourism infrastructure. They had recreated the summer palace, for example, there, and it had daily shows, recreating China's past. So the kind of wooing of foreign investors that China has done has obviously paid huge dividends to them, and perhaps we could have a look at that particular model. And also, if I may just mention, the Swiss investments, as I've already said, fell off drastically in the last few years. And earlier it was in the very good high-tech manufacturing sectors. I believe it's shifted, to non-brick and mortar space where it's so much easier to deal with the Indian ecosystem. So perhaps we should have greater emphasis on logistics and infrastructure so as to attract that kind of FDI back. And also, I think the acquisition of tech assets abroad, which China, of course, with its going out strategy has done in a very big way, it's also a good thing for us, because Piketty, and of course it's economics 101, ODI creates national assets and leads to a higher national income, whereas FDI leads ultimately to an outflow of dividends, profits, etc. I'm not saying, FDI should not be attracted. It must be, because we need that managerial and technological input. But ODI is also a good way to acquire technology assets for our country. Thank you.
All right. Professor Dhar, seems to be would you echo the consensus on the panel, which I seem to be hearing, that that's one point stop that the government should figure out how to communicate, and that by itself could do wonders. Just tell everyone consistency of policy, no harassment, and you're up and running.
No, absolutely, because I think at the end of the day, businesses are looking for consistency of policies. Now, let me give you one example, and this is something that again we've been part of this dialogue for a very long time. After economic reforms, we heard something called a single window clearance. Now, the single window clearance is still not there. It's not there. And the government, of course, every government comes and talks about ease of doing business. Now, I don't understand what it is, because when you look at the situation on the ground, when you talk to the industry, and it's very clear what Smita just mentioned about China. Many of us have been into all these SEZs in China, and then when you go and see that this is really a case in every SEZ where there's a single window clearance. The industry, every part of the infrastructure, everything. And one of the SEZ that I visited, workers' dormitories included, was part of the infrastructure that the government had built. So it was just a plug and play kind of a situation. And then, and in that kind of a situation, the government can actually go and negotiate certain things with the industry, and China did it very well, and Smita has also been looking at it, and this is the whole issue of technology transfer. Now, once you have laid down everything, the government can say, well, if I have given you everything, if the foreign investors have been getting everything, what is there for me? And what the Chinese government has insisted that there should be a domestic value chain where Chinese SMEs get hooked on to these big companies, and of course there is sort of technology transfer happens automatically. You don't have to go and shout in every forum that India needs technology, we are looking at technology, we need technology transfer. That happens automatically as a part of the business deal. So I think there are a lot of issues. A final point that I would like to make is that, look, we started talking about trade, and now we are talking about manufacturing policy, industrial policy, and infrastructure. Now, the biggest problem that we have in this country is that we treat policy making in silos. So there is a trade policy, there is a manufacturing policy, there's an infrastructure policy, and the twain won't meet, and all these things don't actually meet. And that is the biggest problem with policy making in this country.
All right. Well, Mr. Jenson, having correctly pointed to some of the key issues that there are out there. Now, supposing you were the finance minister, I mean, and I also do agree with Mr. Sandhu that it shouldn't necessarily be a budget thing. But if you had to have a little wish list, these are the sort of things we wish we would hear. And if companies abroad and investors abroad certainly heard the following few lines coming reliably from the government of India, it could completely change the way they're looking at India as a crucial part of the global supply chain. What would that be? What would be some of the immediate policies that you think would be announced?
So, Pablo, we've been discussing for the past 15 minutes about policy consistency and no harassment and so forth. I think I would also focus on innovation. And why I'm saying that, because if you look at the innovation ecosystem in Europe, there's a very close connect between industry and academia. So not only industry and government, but also industry and academia. And that triangle is not there as intense in India. So one, there's a much lower spend on research and development and innovation in India, whether it's private or government funded, compared to Europe. And what you've seen in the past, the greatest effect, if you say that large European companies have set up research and development centers in India, has been mostly cost arbitrage based. Yeah, so have a lot of legwork done in India, a lot of the outcome and the value add is really in Europe. But there's a change that these companies are also saying, look, and I'm one of the biggest proponents when I earlier would travel Europe a lot. I would be up there and I'd be one of the biggest proponents of India and tell everybody, don't look at India only as a market, look at it as a place to innovate, to experiment, and don't do it in your own silo, do it with India, because the probability of having a product or solution that's great for an Indian market is much higher if you work together and develop that product solution with Indians. And there's also good examples of when you've done that, and that refers to Davinder's point earlier of Make in India. Once you do that and have something that works in India and is relevant for India, you might actually have created a solution that's interesting for other parts of the world. So you have to be co-creating in India for the rest of the world. So if we could give a message that it makes sense to come to India, to innovate in India, and spend more money on innovation, I think that alone would attract a lot of investment from foreign investors.
All right, I think that's an excellent idea, and probably an idea that the government would have very little hesitation in accepting, because it fits in with the rest of it. Make in India, innovate in India, and take those products around the world is something which almost certainly would be something that the government would love to do. Mr. Sandhu, you advise many governments and others on things that can be done. Now, one of the advantages that we have as of this moment is there's a strong government which can actually probably push through a lot of laws. They've been able to do that, get laws enacted in Parliament and the rest of the things. So if ever there was a time when change could come in the structure of what can be done. Like, for example, a policy that comes in, you can say, okay, for 5 years or 6 years or 7 years, that policy will not change as a matter of continuity. We've heard industry, for example, is increasingly been petitioning the government to say, why don't you have a statute of limitations? So you can't come back, and if you can't frame charges, in let's say 7 years or 5 years or whatever it is, you can't come back and dig up old cases and harass companies with that. That's a suggestion which I know many in industry have been making to the government. So what would be these sort of policies that you think may actually make a big difference on the ground? Laws that can be announced and passed in the next few months?
I think, Vikram, there is no shortage of laws that are enablers. I mean, I am quite clear about this fact. You perhaps don't need new laws under any circumstances to really...
You may need laws to repeal old laws that are causing harassment and problems. That's the thing. So you may want to do away with old laws, old things that are being used to harass people.
It's more a statement of intent. That's what I'm saying. For example, I would say, let the government say, I am segmenting trade and investment proposals into 2 or 3 buckets. It says anybody who's got a trade and investment proposal for more than $1 billion, here is a nominated officer who's going to make sure that this is grounded, and the performance rating or whatever appraisal of that particular officer is to make sure whether this got grounded or not. I mean, we can't treat everybody to come to our office and make a telephone call, take appointments. I think sending that message itself is a very, very important part. It's not a favor to anybody. In that context, what Professor Dhar just said about single windows, this single window, nobody is estimating that it is taking me 6 months' time of interaction with 25 departments to generate that single file, which I'm going to submit at a single window. And all the data lies within the government. So we've been advising the government of India to say, pass a policy which all investors know, if there is a piece of data that lies within the government, then it is the government's job to get the data to facilitate me. If I need some NOC from an urban department, it is your department. Please, I have given you an application. Please get the NOC on my behalf from them. Why do you want me to run around to that particular department and then get it for you and put it in your single window? So the single window actually is a misnomer. It needs nearly 6 months of work and a lot of investment and time before I can file at that single window. I think if these statements are made, which says, if we have data, we'll not ask you. We will facilitate you. If you got investment or trade proposal of a sufficient quantum, here is a nominated person, and this person will chase you and ask you on a daily basis. Tell me what you need. Tell me what you need, and go forward with that. I think it is these statements and appropriate institutions created within the government that become facilitators. Vikram, I again say there are enough laws and policies. It is how we want to use them. If we want to use them in somebody's favor, somebody's help, somebody's facilitation, we can certainly do that. I think this statement, the setting up of the institutional structures within the DA and the concerned sector ministries, and then proof of the pudding being in the eating is very important. I think this is what is clearly needed. The second thing I would say is that if I am producing a product which has got a 25-year investment cycle, I'll be having viability and break even in 10 years time. Then don't scare me by saying that the GST Council is going to sit every 6 months and decide what is going to be the GST on that now. Because the next GST Council may fix a rate that will totally knock me off. So if I come in with a $5 billion proposal and I have got a product line, then please give me policy consistency that even addresses my cash flow. I've taken debt, I've brought equity. And tomorrow, if the GST changes or what am I supposed to do at that point of time? But I think if we make a statement of intent, set up those institutional structures, and the proof of the pudding comes in the eating, what we hear is those voices are right there. And again, this is a time when, so the world is sort of, resettling itself into a new pattern of value chain flows. This is the right time for us to do these kind of messaging very appropriately.
So, Smita, let me throw that same thing to you. Any specific policy prescription that could both attract investment and also, as a corollary, drive exports? What was just being said about policy consistency, and you are making a 10-year, 20-year plan, that is particularly important if, for example, you're attracting semiconductors, some of the areas that you and SITARA and others have been working on, because that's a 20, 25-year investment that you're making. You have to be guaranteed that, a certain consistency over that entire period, and not that something can suddenly happen to derail it. Would you add any other policy prescriptions to that?
No, as concerns FDI, I think everything has already been said by our panelists, and this idea of actually implementing the single window clearance, hand holding. I mean, we have a body called Invest India, but it basically writes letters to state governments, etc. So going with hands folded to each agency will not work. Somebody has to go and actually get it done and implement it. So I don't see that particular institutional innovation having taken place. But I completely endorse what previous panelists have said and have nothing really to add, except perhaps the China model of creating top class infrastructure, ensuring top class logistics. For example, even if we go into semiconductor manufacture, apparently the waiting time between transport of a chip to its final destination is so short that in Singapore they actually, or is it Taiwan, I'm not very sure which one, they actually have helicopters which move it from the factory to the airport, because they cannot even tolerate that little bit of delay that takes place during road transport. And then the turnaround at the ports, all those things have to be synchronized. So as I always say, it's a whole of government approach, not just one ministry. Everyone has to get involved and do it on a national priority basis.
Okay, I'm about to come back to the free trade agreements themselves, but before that, Professor Dhar, when you hear when you hear some of the big problems that are raised by overseas, interlocutors of India, infrastructure used to be a big problem. Has that started to become a little bit better? And when it comes to big problems that are still perhaps need to be sorted out, is it some of the delays in the judicial system that you think perhaps are still a really major issue, because you don't want to get stuck in the Indian legal system, and it could sometimes take 5 years, 10 years for things to be settled, and that becomes almost an unacceptable issue. Of these two traditional problems that people have expressed about, which do you think has gone further towards being solved?
Remain as they are. I think the problem that Mr. Sandhu has been emphasizing is that we have laws, and I would say that we have good laws, but in terms of implementation, everything goes haywire, and that's the single biggest problem that we have in this country. That implementation is absolutely awful. Then all these issues regarding how these matters relating to industry, trade and industry is handling by the judiciary. I think it's very important for us to have dedicated courts. Like in the case of intellectual property, we now have a judge, in the high courts, and there is someone in the Supreme Court as well who knows what it is all about. Now, we need these dedicated courts, otherwise we're not going to go anywhere. And finally, I would say that there is a lot of emphasis being given by the government in terms of how good our policies are. We have an FDI policy which is second to none. We have liberalized and stuff like that. Now, I think this while good policies are important, we've been discussing it. Implementation of good policies and what lies behind it. What kind of institutional framework are we going to provide in order to implement those policies? Because I think all of us would agree on one thing, that the institutional basis in India, in everything that you can think of, is extremely weak. And one big problem for this is that we went from a state-controlled economy to completely liberalized economy, but in terms of institutions on the ground, they haven't actually changed, and therefore we find this kind of a mismatch. Again, this can't happen. Institutions can't change on their own. Again, I would come back to my first point that I made, that institutions can only change when the government listens to those who are actually, using or benefiting from these institutions, and that is the industry.
I think that's a very valid point. But Mr. Sandhu, if I could come back to you, changing the way institutions function on the ground, or the way that laws and others are being implemented on the ground, is difficult. It's problematic at the best of time. With the best of intentions, it takes time to change the way things are done on the ground. And we've all watched Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister. It used to be problematic even in any country of the world. Sometimes these things are difficult, which is why you may sometimes need to change the laws, the rules, the regulations, what can be taken to court, what cannot be taken to court, should old cases be disposed of after X period of time without anything else. Should you have what levels of authority can an inspector, for example, have? Because if laws are there, if rules are there, if regulations are there, they can be misused. Now, in the last budget, and that's why this is an interesting message perhaps the finance minister will be considering right now. If you take a look at what she announced in the last budget, she said you can't open income tax cases after, let's say, 3 years or 5 years. And similar changes have come in other areas of government also. Now, the advantage of those is that once that becomes a law or a rule that is put into place, faceless assessment, something else that this finance minister has introduced. Now, once things like that come in, it then becomes very difficult for the system to then play around with it. What do? How can you, once a new way of doing things is being legislated and put into place, that's the way it is now. And it's hopefully people friendly and industry friendly.
So that's the right way to go, Vikram. And I mean, there's almost a century of even pre-independence laws, and there's a lot of experience around that and how bureaucracy is sometimes said to be ossified. But I think there is change in the air. For example, one huge advantage is self-certification now. So self-certification, one can file. That's very important, and I think that's lending a lot of confidence, even to a lot of MSME investors who are finding joint ventures with foreign partners, because then compliance burdens are going down. So I think those kind of laws. Then another one which I think there was a state government. I think Telangana has introduced that since there is no barriers because of GST, in case the local GST inspector is going to flag down a truck, then he has to actually fill into send a text message on somewhere that I'm going to stop this truck. So he can go and do that, but he has to inform in the system. And so there has to be a reason for him to do that. And I think those kind of disablers of, the suspect practices are something that's very confidence inspiring.
Right.
The way India is leveraging digital technologies in this sense to make it more easier, not only for the citizens' quality of life, but even for the entrepreneurs and innovators' quality of life. I think these are very good markers to go forward. So I think those laws are being changed. Professor Dhar talked of courts. Setting up commercial courts is one of the important considerations as states are being ranked in the business reforms process. And a number of commercial courts have come up, and there are pressures from the chief ministers to the chief justice of the High Court to come out with those nominations, and then they are being put in place. But I think, like Smitaji, I've been a former civil servant for nearly 2.5 decades before I went to the private sector. I think this whole aspect of looking at a discretion with suspect eyes has to go away. And therefore, that kind of enablement, which also comes to the decision makers, that a discretionary action will not always be viewed with suspicion. That's important. In that sense, I think there are two elements which are enablers, which should be used. One is independent sort of audit. Say for NHI, there are independent engineers. If there is an environmental decision, for example, they could be environmental accountants, who could come in and advise and check and be a kind of a arm's length third party, auditor, which sends a report back. That lends a lot of confidence to the decision maker to actually take those decisions, which are discussion based. And then civil society. I think we are not leveraging civil society enough. Where is the need for me to actually, be totally hands-on in environmental protection in industrial unit, when I can actually ask the 3 panchayats around that area and say, all right, you tell me, are they observing the environmental norms or not? Who's more concerned about their environment than the mother whose child, is living in that area? So I think if we do these self-certifications, the arm's length, independent kind of persons who are doing the checks, third-party administrator kind of like they do in insurance nowadays, and then involve civil society and gram panchayats and ULBs in these exercises, right. I think it becomes so much more easier. And I think these are the right conversations that are happening. I'm hearing these conversations right from the highest levels in the government to industry bodies, and I think we will see this come up very soon now.
Well, that's great, because a lot of what we've been discussing as ways of enabling FDI and enabling foreign investment into India and getting the rest of the world excited about India, these are the very same policies that will also give a fillip to Indian industry and unleash their animal spirits and get them activated. So these policies have a double benefit. But before I wrap, Mr. Jenson, anything else which you would want to say about trade specifically, and about how the rest of the world and Europe in particular are viewing India as a trade partner, and any suggestions you might have for the government for what they should say specifically on that?
No, for sure. I mentioned it earlier. For sure, India is becoming more and more on the map of Europe. There's no doubt about that, and for all the right reasons. So there's still a lot of work to be done. One thing we've not been talking about at all today, and one thing that I also hope the budget will bring out is some expenditure, more expenditure on skilling and education, because only that way will, because one big topic, of course, now, if you look at sustainability, ESG reporting, so there's a lot of push from the markets towards producers to be sustainable. And if Indian SMEs, if Indian businesses want to be a larger part of global value chains, this will become a big focus, and that will only happen once there's awareness about these sort of standards, but also once you have access to a pool of skilled labor and educated workforce that can actually implement these standards. So I think that's a huge focus where the government should focus, and it's a pain point for many foreign companies. I mean, I don't have to tell you about you. So in aviation, for instance, largest supplier to an American aviation manufacturer wanted to set up shop in India. Could not find the value chain to be set up as quickly as he wanted to. Invited to 30, or I think 35 local suppliers from back home from the US, and spent a lot of time and effort on setting up that cluster in India. Now that obviously has the ripple effect of involving Indian suppliers, but I mean, I think India can move a step ahead of that and become more quality focused in its manufacturing and become a closer part of those large supply chains. So yeah, more spend on skilling.
All right, Mr. Jenson. Well, I'm afraid we are flat out of time. I think we could keep on going on for a while more, but we are out of time. So thank you all so much for joining us. Let's see how much of this we actually hear about in the budget, and even more importantly, how much of this is actually implemented in the weeks and months that follow the budget, because I guess the proof of the pudding is always in the eating. Thank you all so much for having joined us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vikram. Thank you all.